everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is our class for Tuesday, the 3rd of November. And what I thought I would do, now that we've done an introduction to the class and I've tried to address any questions that you might have had, is to proceed with some of the textbook readings. And I put most of those readings up at front so that we could use them for when we actually perform our speeches. So I've got 3 chapters that were scheduled for today. Chapter 1, Speech and Higher Education. Chapter 2, Getting Started. And lastly, Chapter 3, Critical Listening. Though I'm well aware that we're still at the early part of the semester, so people are still dropping and adding and getting books, so that if it turns out that you weren't able to have that reading done by today, I ask that you get that reading done as soon as you can. But I'm anticipating that hopefully by the ending of this week, all of you will have your text and that you will be ready to review some of the material in the text as we get ready for our first speech. But before we talk about any of that, I wanted to talk about something that was not included in the reading, and it is called Toastmasters. And basically, Toastmasters is an international organization that's devoted to helping its members improve their public speaking skills. And you can see in the notes below, I've included the website for them if you wanted to investigate further. And they've got chapters, including in Western Massachusetts. And they actually put together a video where they reviewed all of the elements of public speaking. It's approximately a half hour long or so, and I thought that this would be a good way to begin the class. And I was able to find the link for that video on YouTube, and you can see that in the notes below as well. So what I recommend you do is that you stop watching my video now and that you watch the video about Toastmasters, and then you can continue back with this video where I'm talking a little bit about what is in the Toastmasters video and what is in some of the readings for class. So I'm hopeful that at this point you've been able to watch that Toastmasters video where it goes through the entire process of how to pull together a speech. And you can see that I've identified some of the major points of that video. That basically speeches can be divided into 3 categories. The first is an informative speech where you're trying to teach your audience something. And it's important to be clear and concise. And in fact, that's what you will be doing this semester for speech number 2. There's also the persuasive speech, and this is where oftentimes you need to motivate your audience and you need to utilize emotion. And in fact, that will be your 3rd speech this semester, the persuasive speech. And then sometimes speeches are delivered just merely for entertainment. Now, that said, I don't necessarily think we've got a speech of that sort, but we do have as our first speech the autobiographical speech, which I personally find to be very entertaining when I get to find out about my students. And perhaps I think you might view it in exactly the same way when you get to find out about your fellow peers in a way that you probably wouldn't in other classes. So perhaps we could say that that first speech has elements of being entertaining where you use stories and humor. And in fact, these divisions are somewhat artificial because I would say that all speeches have, or at least good speeches, have elements of entertainment within them. And they also have elements of information within them. And they also have elements of persuasion within them. But just for the sake of this semester, we're dividing them up into categories. But think about your first speech, the 5-minute autobiographical speech. That, yes, it probably will be somewhat entertaining, but it will also be informative because you're going to be teaching us about your life. And even persuasive. The idea is that whatever elements you decide to share with us, you're trying to convince us those are important in terms of our understanding who you are. So, in terms of thinking about perhaps the most important part of speech delivery, it's practice, 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 and practice, as was reiterated in the video, and I'm reiterating in my notes that the more often you practice, you become familiar with the material. The video, you've even got an individual who's practicing in front of her dog. It doesn't necessarily matter who the audience is. You can even practice in front of a mirror. But the idea is that the more familiar you become with the material and with the delivery, then the more comfortable you're going to be. So probably the first thing you need to do is to prepare. So you need to think about the logistics. In other words, where will you be delivering your speech? Who is your audience? What is the objective? Do you need to do any kind of outside research? And then finally, you begin to brainstorm or to write. So you need to know the details of the speech itself. And usually, in terms of the writing, we can divide it up into 3 categories. And if you've ever taken an English class, you're probably familiar with these: the introduction, the body or the discussion section, and finally, the conclusion. And the introduction is the beginning of the speech. This is where you greet your audience and perhaps you indicate what your main point or thesis is. The discussion is the midsection of the speech, and this is where you give your evidence and details. And then the conclusion is the ending of the speech. This is where you give some closure and you say farewell to your audience. And then the second piece is the actual presentation, and that's how it's different from writing a paper, where you have to think about delivery. You want to be conversational. You don't want to be too stiff or stilted. You don't want to read your speech or memorize your speech. But instead, what you want is a speaking outline, which is something that we are going to be talking about in class. Something that lists the key words and phrases that you're planning on discussing. And then ultimately, that serves as your guideline, a map, if you will. But you still want to have a certain level of spontaneity when you are delivering your speech. And you want to think about things like eye contact. And you want to think about things like body language and vocal inflections. And you want to try to vary those as much as possible to keep your audience interest, as well as using silence or pauses sometimes for dramatic effect. And whenever possible, anticipating your audience's questions. So in the event, if an audience member asks a question, you're not caught unprepared. So that basically was the overview of the Toastmasters video that serves as, I believe, a kind of summary of what we will be discussing from the class textbook over the next several classes before we actually deliver our speech. So in terms of the first chapter, it was entitled Speech in Higher Ed. Basically, what they're trying to do in that chapter is to convince us as readers that public speaking is an important skill, and not just for academic purposes. There is something called the intellectual imperative. Notice we're being introduced to some of the language or jargon associated with the discipline. The intellectual imperative is about being intellectual, or in other words, being well-educated. That a well-educated person has knowledge of things such as communication and mathematics and history and so forth. But there also is the idea of the social imperative. In other words, just as human beings, we are social beings and we interact with one another. So the act of speaking is something that's important so we can communicate with each other. That has absolutely nothing to do with the classroom. It's just about our daily events and our daily interactions. And then lastly, there's something called the consumer imperative, which I've become more and more interested in as the semester has progressed. That basically, as an audience member, you are consuming the speeches of others, so that ultimately you want to be able to evaluate those speeches using the same criteria that you hold yourself to when you are delivering a speech. And I oftentimes say that this is a very difficult class to teach because while I'm giving suggestions about how to deliver a speech, chances are you're watching speeches, perhaps in the political arena, that aren't necessarily following the same criteria. And my suggestion to you is that you should hold those individuals accountable and that they should be held to the same level of quality that you're held to as well. So I can't remember if I mentioned at the beginning of this video that today is November 3rd and Election Day. So I hope you do vote. So that's part of the consumer imperative, I suppose, is how you've evaluated the information given to you by the candidates in order to make a final decision. Now think about public speaking as a kind of circular process. Usually, an individual who's giving a speech is very focused on themselves and the speech which they deliver. So we've got a speaker and a message, but it doesn't stop there. The message is delivered to the audience, and then the audience provides feedback. Sometimes obvious feedback by asking a question, or sometimes less obvious, let's say with body language. And then a good speaker adjusts accordingly, within reason, of course. You can't completely reinvent the speech. So you can think of the speech as this big circle. It isn't just you presenting to an audience, but an audience responding and you hopefully being able to pick up on those clues and to use that to your benefit. And perhaps the most important part of chapter number 1 is a term called ethos, which sounds like ethics because that's the Greek word for ethics, or credibility, and that you want to try to be as ethical as possible and as truthful as possible when you are delivering a speech. And that said, when I was talking about holding speakers accountable, if you think they aren't being ethical, if they aren't illustrating ethos, you should call them on that. Your first speech, your autobiographical speech, has already embedded ethos within it because the speech is about your life. So the assumption is that you have a level of expertise and truthfulness about your life that you will be sharing with us. As we continue on with the speeches, some of them being informative and persuasive, perhaps you may need to establish your ethos or your ethical credibility, that you've already got knowledge about this subject. But that isn't the case with the first speech. It's one of the reasons why the autobiographical speech is the first speech, as well as the fact that you know the material very well. It's your life. Chances are you know the material better than you will know anything else because you have lived experience with what you will be sharing. That said, you need to make decisions about what to share in just 5 minutes because obviously you've got more than 5 minutes of speaking history involved in your life story. So you might want to focus on some highlights of important events, or you might want to focus on a particular time period or a particular element like a hobby or a person. Just keep in mind, whatever it is that you share is that it's supposed to help us get more of a sense of who you are as an individual and what you value in your life and why. But we'll talk about that further. The second chapter I had assigned was entitled Getting Started, which is exactly what you are doing. You are getting started for your speech number 1, the autobiographical speech, which I have scheduled for Tuesday, the 17th of November. So we've got a little bit of time to talk about several of the chapters in the textbook that will help you put together that speech. And again, you have a 5-minute time period to give an autobiographical speech that tells the audience something about you and your life, perhaps a life overview or a hobby or an educational goal. And what we will do is talk about the idea of timing with speeches. I certainly won't be sitting there with a stopwatch, but the idea is that you get to as close to 5 minutes as you can. Figure that you've got about a minute wiggle room on either end. And certainly as the speeches become longer, you have more and more wiggle room. So certainly if you were giving an hour speech, perhaps going over by 5 minutes is not a terrible thing. But if you're giving a 5-minute speech and you're going over by 5 minutes, well, that is a terrible thing because that's basically double the length that you were given. So it's about balance. And in terms of speech delivery, if this were a normal semester, you would be delivering your speeches in class to your classmates. But obviously, there's nothing normal about this particular semester. So what I wanted to do is to try to be as flexible as possible. So you've got 2 options on how to proceed with your speeches. You can either elect to deliver your speeches live via Zoom, or you can elect to pre-record your speeches and to upload them onto Moodle. And there are pros and cons for each. For those of you who think you would like to deliver your classes via Zoom, if you could please send me an email to Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, indicating that you would like to deliver your first speech via Zoom, and also what your times of availability would be for you to deliver that speech on Tuesday, the 17th. And what I'm going to try to do is to find a common time where all of us can do that via Zoom. For those of you who would not like to do that, what you can do on the 17th is basically post your speech onto Moodle. I will add a section for speech number 1 where you can post your speech. You've got up until midnight of the 17th in order to be able to do that. And then basically what will happen is that the attendance question will be for your classmates to view that speech and to give their feedback about what they thought was one strength and one weakness for the speech, which is how I will proceed with Zoom as well, is that I will ask individuals to give a strength and to give a weakness about the speech. So speech delivery, again, is going to be very much determined up to you, and you can make the another decision for speech number 2, which is the informational speech, which we'll talk about when we get a little bit farther in class, closer to that speech. And then the same for the persuasive speech. So in other words, you don't have to make a commitment to do all 3 speeches the same way, depending on your own time and your own obligations. You can make decisions as to what makes sense. So, in terms of that second chapter about getting started, what they do is they give you a image that looks like a staircase, which I think is very appropriate for what it is we're going to be doing. And we're at the bottom of the staircase now, working our way up. And we're at the bottom where we are selecting and narrowing our topic. So that's the first stair, so to speak. So that's what you're thinking about now. You know it's an autobiographical speech. And you may even be thinking ahead about the persuasive and the informational speeches, but the focus should be on the autobiographical speech. So what is it exactly that you're planning on sharing about your particular life? And then you're determining the purpose of the speech. Why are you giving this particular speech? And for you, it might be very obvious. Well, you need to satisfy a requirement for a class so that you successfully complete this course. But for me, the reason why you're giving this speech is twofold. The first is to allow you to practice the speech delivery skills that we are going to be talking about over the next several classes. And secondly is so that we can get to know each other a little bit better as a class. And again, you might have your own individual purposes as to why you're delivering a speech. It could be that you're trying to impress someone in your audience, for instance, but you need to think about the purpose. And then you need to analyze your audience and occasion. And you are at an advantage there because your audience is your classmates and the occasion is for an academic situation. And what I like to do is to oftentimes give real stories. I call these, you can't make this stuff up, to sort of illustrate some of these points. And this actually happened. And it happened to a colleague of mine at another college. I won't indicate which college, but it was a public speaking class. And it was a student who was giving a speech. It was a very philosophical speech about the importance of remaining true to oneself. And over the course of the speech, the student began to slowly disrobe until finally the teacher stopped the student as they were unbuttoning a belt, and it looked like they were about to drop their pants, and asked, what exactly is happening here? And the student responded by saying, I need to show you the true me because this speech is about being true to oneself. And the teacher said right there, stop. We've seen enough of the true you. Again, true story. But might I suggest that this student was not thinking about the audience or the occasion of this speech, that it would not be appropriate to disrobe in the classroom in front of their classmates. If you learn nothing else this semester, as I like to tell my students, do not disrobe during your speech. So, as I indicated, you do know the occasion. It's an academic situation. You do know your audience. That said, things are a little bit more informal because we will be presenting via Zoom or we will be presenting through video. I've oftentimes said this to my students as well, even in an academic context, you want to be dressed neatly, but you don't necessarily have to be dressed professionally. So you don't necessarily have to feel compelled to wear a suit, for instance. But you do want to wear something that's appropriate, and you do want to have an environment that seems somewhat appropriate, understanding the limitations that all of us are experiencing now that we can't meet live in person. And then if you need to gather material, you would do so. For your first speech, I suspect you are not going to need to gather material because that first speech is about yourself. However, this could be a good excuse for you to interview family members about, let's say, your genealogy or to do a little bit of genealogical research if you so wanted to, but certainly not required. And then making a speaking outline, which is going to be an entire chapter that we will be discussing. And then finally practice. And in fact, I'm going to be devoting a class just to our practicing. And that will be coming up where you've got the option of either sending me an email of what you are going to be doing with your speech, or we can meet live via Zoom, or if you prefer, we could do it via telephone. Again, I'm trying to be as flexible as possible. And then finally, the actual delivery of the speech, which will be on the 17th, which happens to be on Tuesday. And the last chapter that I assigned for today was critical listening, and that's chapter 3, that your role as an audience member is just as important as your role as a speaker. We could all practice public speaking on our own, but the key is to have other individuals give feedback. So whether you do it via Zoom and those of us on Zoom can respond, or whether you post it online and then your classmates can respond. Ideally, you would be getting feedback live, but that's not going to be a possibility this semester. And in terms of critical listening, the distinction between hearing, which is just processing sound, as opposed to listening, which is actually paying attention. And you want to pay close attention to your peers, not just as a sign of respect, but it's also a way for you to help develop your public speaking skills. Because not only will you be delivering a speech that is an autobiographical speech, but you'll get to listen to your classmates. And in fact, as we get a little bit closer to that speech, I'm going to show you some practice speeches. In no way were these speeches affiliated with any students at GCC. So these were speeches that are on YouTube that I'm assuming are available for public consumption if they were posted on YouTube, so that ultimately we could review those speeches and critique them and be much more perhaps detailed and harsh than we would ever be with each other, because we can fast forward and rewind and so forth and use that as a learning exercise. So those are some of the things that'll be coming up over the course of the semester. And in terms of paying attention, I'm sure that you're already familiar about some of the barriers that can stand in the way of paying attention, though you may not be familiar with some of the technical terms. For instance, daydreaming is oftentimes a barrier to paying attention, if for no other reason we think more quickly than someone can speak, so our mind tends to wander. There's actually a term for that. It's called the internal perceptual field, what's going on internally, and how one thought can lead to another and lead to another, and before you know it, you've lost a good amount of time, and more importantly, you've lost a good amount of content, and you're not necessarily sure what happened. It's one of the reasons why teachers recommend that you do things like taking notes to help prevent you from daydreaming and to keep you on task. And then the second piece is called the environment, the environmental factors that can perhaps stand in the way of your paying attention. Things like temperature, light, noise, for instance. And that too has a technical term. It's called the external perceptual field because it's based on the external. And sometimes you can control that, sometimes you can't. So if you think about a classroom situation, which you might have seen as a teacher, for instance, opening or closing a door to the classroom, perhaps opening the door because the temperature was too warm in the classroom and might have interfered with students paying attention. Or perhaps closing the door because there was noise outside in the hallway, and again, that might have interfered with students paying attention. Though there are things that you may not necessarily be able to control, such as lighting in a classroom, and you're just going to have to do the best that you can. In terms of thinking about questions when you're listening, I've included in our syllabus and other documents section a handout entitled the Speech Rating Handout that I'm going to be covering next class that talks a little bit about some of the things that you should consider when you're listening to the speeches of others, some of the things you should be considering when you are pulling together your own speech, and some of the things I will be considering when I'm evaluating your first speech. In fact, I will be using that template as a scoring guide for your first speech, and then I'll be putting some comments and a letter grade and then returning that back to you. That said, for the second and the third speech, I don't even bother using that template. I just take a piece of paper and I take notes as they occur to me. But I thought that template would serve as some good foundation for us about some of the things to think about in terms of the content of the speech and the delivery of the speech. So this is where we're going to pick up next class, as well as the next 3 readings that I have assigned for us to discuss from our textbook. And for today's attendance question, which you would answer on our discussion forum by Wednesday, November 4th at noon, is talking about something that was discussed in the Toastmasters video that I deliberately did not put in our notes. And I don't know if you noticed what was missing or not, but what I left off of our notes from the Toastmasters video was nervousness. And this is a reality whenever anybody gives a speech in public or performs in front of an audience. So I thought it would be best just to deal with that now. If we were meeting in class, this would be our group activity where I would put you into groups and have you spend 10 minutes or so generating ideas on ways to combat nerves. And then we would put this all on a whiteboard or a smart board. But instead, what we will do is do this via our discussion form, where I'm asking, what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? And again, once you've responded to that particular question on the discussion form, you've satisfied the attendance requirement. Certainly, you can respond to your classmates, and if you so decide to do that, you can think of that as class participation, as if you were raising your hand in class. And again, many people learn in different ways. Some learn through lots of discussion, and some learn through more quiet contemplation. So I'm not requiring you to interact with your classmates on the class discussion forum. What I am requiring you to do is to read all of your classmates' responses on the discussion forum and my responses to those, because I will always respond to your response. And that will give you a sense of what we might have discussed in class. And then again, if anything occurs to you and you wanted to write a response, you certainly could. So I will be posting that question on our discussion forum. We will continue on next class by talking about listening to speeches, specifically the speech rating sheet. And then we will continue to talk about the process of pulling together speeches. So I hope you are doing well. I am doing well. And we will continue on next class on Thursday. Take care. Bye-bye.